a distorted sense of time, an unreal or absent self, emotional or physical numbing. And derealization could be described as expect to, for example, individual experience as unreal, dreamlike, foggy, lifeless, or visually distorted. Basically, during depersonalization or derealization, reality testing remains intact though. So people are aware that something odd is happening and that what is happening does not reflect reality, but they still can't shake the feeling, so to say. And this also comes up in historical case examples from neurological case studies. For example, the neurologist Theodore Ribot quotes a patient as follows in 1869. My individuality has completely disappeared. The manner in which I see things render me incapable of recognizing, feeling that they, the things, exist. Even on touching and seeing, the world appears to me like a phantom, a gigantic hallucination. I am perfectly conscious of the absurdity of these ideas, but cannot overcome them. And another patient put it, in connection with urban encounters and alienation in the city, put it like this. I know that I must be walking, but I have no consciousness of walking, that it is me who is walking. I make efforts to prove to myself that it really is me, and often I need to enter a shop, to talk, to ask something, so as to give myself proof anew that I really am me. And I find this really interesting in connection to Symphony in Yellow, because there I would suggest that depersonalization and derealization are symptomized by a sort of liminality of space and time in the way that the speaker experiences light, color, and unsteady motifs. So to look again at the poem, the speaker knows that he is in London, right? He refers in line 10 to the Temple Elms, and Temple is a district in London. So the speaker knows that he is in London, but the external world still seems unfamiliar, strange, and dreamlike in the way that he describes it, unreal, as though seen behind a yellow filter, or again, sort of this imagery of behind a pane of glass. The place of the speaker's awareness of his physical body is uncertain as well. Sort of the at my feet in line 11 has this quality of an outside observer, which also references back to the DSM-5 definition. And what I find particularly interesting is that it's basically the phenomenon turned physical in the poem itself. I mean, we've sort of got this liminality of location on the edge of land and river, the sort of physical instability in a place of transit, which I find illustrates this sort of lack of a stable interiority very well. Moving on to the sense of time. I mean, there's a lack of a sense of what time it is, which is also a characteristic of dissociative states. We don't know what time of day it is. I mean, the speaker either does not know himself or he cannot convey it. It could be morning, rush hour, as seen in stanza 1, or it could be in the evening. I mean, it's sort of a shadowy, foggy type of environment that we're not sure is it nightfall, or is it maybe beginning to grow light? And the present tense only exacerbates the singular immediacy, this sort of disconnect between the past and what might come in the future. And the skewed sense of time I also found interesting in sort of in line 9 and 10, with the skewed sense of time between how the yellow leaves begin to fall, but at the same time they then quickly flutter from the elms. It's sort of quite an interesting disconnect I found. And the sort of circular sing-song ABBA rhyme scheme only heightens this immersion, this sort of disconnect from the past or the future. Yeah, moving on to light, color, and recurring motifs. I wondered whether the color perception was perhaps dissociative as well, because the whole poem is sort of doused in this yellow light, which I mean, so in some case studies, I saw that some people also had difficulties with color perception. And what also came up for me in the poem was that the passers-by as midges could, on the one hand, of course, be a metaphor, and the omnibus as the butterfly as well. But seeing things in different sizes from what they really are is also a symptom of dissociation. So that might not be accidental either. And the whole poem itself is sort of diffused with unsteadiness. It's sort of, there are only metamorphic, only momentarily steadying instances. For example, the barges that pass the speaker by, and sort of a sort of porous sense of self, a porous materiality, also shown in the synecdochal self-reference of the silken scarf in line 7. The speaker himself does not come across as a grounded instance in the poem. And of course, there are also the decadent themes of morbidity, death, and the liminality of life. Sort of the colors of yellow, pale green, and jade could raise associations of sickness. And in line 11, one could say that the epistemological insight of the speaker seeing his feet and possibly recognizing that they are his own, is immediately washed again away in the Thames, when in line 12, I would argue the speaker dissociates away again. Now, because it's interesting for Wilfred Owen's poem that I want to discuss, I want to briefly look at Wilde's Impressions du Matin. I'll read to you the first few stanzas. The Thames nocturne of blue and gold changed to a harmony in grey. A barge with ochre-coloured hay dropped from the wharf in chill and cold. The yellow fog came creeping down the bridges till the houses' walls seemed changed to shadows, and St. Paul's loomed like a bubble o'er the town. Then suddenly arose the clang of waking life. The streets were stirred with country wagons, and a bird flew to the glistening roofs and sang. But one pale woman all alone, the daylight kissing her wan hair, loitered beneath the gas lamp's flare, with lips of flame and heart of stone. And I found this to be a more extreme variety, perhaps, than Symphony in Yellow even, because while it's very subjective, which makes it so lyrical, there is no I present at all. There is no individual interiority present at all, which gives it instead quite a narrative quality, I would say. And this was a poem that Wilfred Owen used as his template for Shadwell Stare. I mean, one could basically say that Shadwell Stare is a pastiche of Oscar Wilde's Impressions du Matin. So moving on to Wilfred Owen. I'll first read it to you again, and before I want to inject the information that Shadwell Stare, I mean, the Shadwell Dock Stairs are a part of the London docks in Eastern London, and they're stairs that lead into the Thames. It was written in 1918 at Craiglockhart Hospital after Owen had already been injured and hospitalized. And interestingly, it's a return to the decadent style of Owen's youth, which had been largely abandoned after he'd met Sigrid Sassoon. So this may sound quite differently to how you may be used to hearing Owen sound. I'll read it to you again.
Sorry, Teresa, just a quick note that we're at the 15-minute mark, just to give you a sense of time. Yeah,
I haven't got much left. Thank you. I am the ghost of Shadwell Stare. Along the wharves by the waterhouse and through the cavernous slaughterhouse, I am the shadow that walks there. Yet I have flesh both firm and cool, and eyes tumultuous as the gems of moons and lamps in the full Thames, when dusk sails wavering down the pool. Shuddering the purple street arc burns where I watch always. From the banks, dolorously, the shipping clanks, and after me a strange tide turns. I walk till the stars of London wane, and dawn creeps up the Shadwell Stair, but when the crowing sirens blare, I with another ghost am lain. And what I find really interesting is that while Impressions du Matin was written in past tense, here we are in the present again. And also the sense of an I is not really wholly real here, even though I as a pronoun is mentioned several times, but instead of as a real living person, the I appears as a ghost. Again, we've got the synecdochal use of the Thames, like Wilde did. I mean, in line 6 and 7, the eyes are compared to gems of moons and Thames and moons and lamps in the full Thames. And again, we've got the present tense, like in Symphony in Yellow. And this could be read as a linguistic marker of trauma, because in accounts of trauma, it's noticeable that people switch to the present tense as if they were experiencing the event or whatever happened again, even though it really is in the past, which is why I find it really interesting that Owen in this poem and also Wilde in the previous one used the present tense, because as far as I'm aware, it's quite a rare phenomenon in lyric poetry as we read it in general. Here, unlike Symphony in Yellow, it's identifiable that it's night, but still there's a skewed temporal presence. I mean, always in line 10. Why does he say where I watch always? I mean, is it because he's a ghost and he's not really there, or because his sense of time is lost? I mean, it sort of seems lifeless and derealized in a way. And interestingly enough as well, one of the very first examples of depersonalization was actually of a British Army colonel. The ear, nose and throat specialist Maurice Krishaber gives the account of a 34-year-old British Army colonel. He said, "I felt as if I was almost entirely separated from the world, and as if there was some barrier between me and it. I doubted of my own existence and at times even disbelieved in it. I felt as if I was literally falling to pieces." And I found that the metaphor of ghost fits well with this. Since I already ran out of time, this is all I'll say about the poems, just a brief conclusion. I wondered about the overarching factors facilitating dissociation, and there I just, generally wondered. I mean, the artists in the symbolist and decadent movements were not part of the mainstream. In fact, they were ridiculed by large parts of society. They faced a clash of sensibilities. On the one hand, they're longing for a pastoral life detached from industrial society versus luxuries of life within, which was sort of an interior war that they and their movement had, I suppose. There were also challenges concerning sexual and gender identities. Of course, Wilde and Owen were both gay. And there's also the role of drugs. I mean, opium and cannabis were widely available, certainly in the late Victorian era. And in the case of war poets, we could say that these phenomena could be, in the poetry, could be direct effects of war trauma that they try to translate into poetry. Yet I find that through poetry, these authors found a way to give a voice to these states, which are so difficult to voice. Yeah, thank you. And I'll be looking forward to your suggestions and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so rich. I think there will be a lot to go back to. In the meantime, moving on to our next speaker, this is Pizzer Hanks, who is a scholar trained in 19th century British literature, and whose scholarship revolves around questions of epistogenesis raised by current corporate trends in higher education writing pedagogy, as well as persistent trends of masculinism and white supremacy in transatlantic classical reception of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century and the Western canon at large. He is currently working on a project about the rhetorical effects of sympathy on the formation of the normative subject in the US, and on a second project which theorizes an approach to writing pedagogy based on Louise Rosenblatt's concept of transaction. So thank you so much for being here with us, Thomas.
Thank you so much for having me, Lorenzo. And Lorenzo, could I ask you a favor? Would you mind putting the transcript that I sent you in the chat? Just in case there's anybody who prefers to read along, or any of our colleagues who are deaf or hard of hearing. I want to make sure that you have access to this. And if anybody wants a copy of the transcript, I'm more than, well, you can just download it from the chat. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to look at a PowerPoint. I get a little sucked into the artwork, so my apologies. All right. So first of all, thank you for being here, everyone. And especially thank you to Lorenzo Bartolucci for facilitating this panel. Today, I'm going to be talking about cognitive literary studies, and particularly cognitive literary studies in the context of the challenge of neurodiversity. And the question that I'm really asking here is, whose mind is the mind? By reading the history of cognitive science against the history of literary reception studies, this presentation suggests that cognitive literary studies has long struggled and continues to struggle to escape the constraints of a singular model of mind borrowed from the neuroscientific tradition. The problematic aspect of this phenomenon, in my opinion, is that a universalist model of mind assumes an average perceiver whose specific identity is impossible to define, giving rise to empty rhetoric that lacks context, and thus diminishes the force of our claims. And I'm thinking particularly of phrases like this: the mind, the brain, the reader. Ask yourself, who is denoted by these terms? Given that scientific studies have often been biased by broad commonalities among their participants, who have often been male or white or college students, or all three, not to mention more or less neurotypical and shaped by life experiences that are not necessarily broadly shared among the rest of the human population, it may be that this average perceiver, the mind, the brain, the reader, is in fact marked by an unmarked specificity that undercuts the universalist claims of some cognitive literary theorists. That's what I want to explore today. I had promised to integrate Rosenblatt's transaction theory, but in the course of my research, I'm finding that secure conclusions really are not yet warranted. So instead, I bring you questions, as we will see. Obviously, this argument needs further explanation. These claims are not meant to indicate, first of all, that I find no value in cognitive literary studies, quite the opposite. If I didn't think that a cognitivist approach was both useful and interesting, I certainly wouldn't have read all the articles I read to prepare for this presentation, nor would I be engaged in the larger project of reviewing cognitive literary studies as a field to determine the ways universalist epistemology is shaping our shared endeavor. Indeed, I find the problematic aspects of our field interesting precisely because they participate in a long tradition of thought of which I am a student. Let me explain what I mean. The history of cognitive science, like that of Western thought more generally, is marked by a division between universalist and atomistic epistemologies. We can think of this more or less as Protagoras versus Plato, or even more sharply, Nietzsche versus Plato. This division is typically subsumed by other secondary methodological assumptions in works of literary criticism, but comes to the fore in cognitive literary studies. Because the assumptions we make about reception necessarily include assumptions about readers' minds and the effects of literary works upon them, cognitive literary studies takes as a primary object of inquiry precisely the problem Plato points to so insistently in The Republic, that of how or if we can predict the effects of a text on an audience. Plato assumes not only that we can predict the course of reception, but that we can control it, and that there is one ideal reception process into which all other actual perceivers should be funneled via artful rhetoric. In his The Genealogy of Morals, on the other hand, Nietzsche argues thusly: the only seeing we have is seeing from a perspective. The only knowledge we have is knowledge from a perspective. The more emotional affects we allow to be expressed in words concerning something, the more different eyes we know how to train on the same thing, the more complete our idea of this thing, our objectivity, will be. Clearly, the question of whether or not one adopts an idealist or a perspectivist approach to cognition necessarily has everything to do with our cognitive imaginary as it explains mentation and perception. And whether or not one is an idealist has a particularly determinative effect on whether or not one is comfortable with a singular model of mind. This broad epistemological division between idealism and perspectivism continues throughout Western intellectual history in varying degrees in various contexts. That is why I can compare Plato to Nietzsche, and why Nietzsche himself does the same. During Nietzsche's lifetime, this division was expressed in many facets of the globalizing culture of the developing world system, and one important way this happened was in the emerging transatlantic tradition of neuroscience. The competing cognitive imaginaries in early neuroscience don't really have specific names, but they do have well-known representatives that I will take as synecdoches for the whole, given the constraints operating here. These representatives are craniometry and phrenology. Here we see images from the works of a man named Samuel George Morton, who was the father of American craniometry. As the name indicates, craniometry has to do with the measurement of the skull. And one of the major variables Morton studied was the size of the brain. He believed that larger brain people were necessarily smarter, and he studied thousands of skulls. On the right, we see the skulls of ancient Egyptian mummies. On the left, the mandibular goniometer invented by Paul Broca and used by Morton to measure various surface aspects of the skulls he studied. From these measurements, Morton promulgated a hierarchical system of human race and of human worth that was widely accepted and adapted by the middle of the 19th century in Western Europe and North America. Here we see a detail from a chart displaying the cranial measurements of various so-called races, compared in cranial excellence to Georges Cuvier, a French naturalist and early proponent of racial theory, who is widely considered one of the founders of paleontology. It is worth noting that in the larger version of this image, there are 54 heads displayed, only one of which is female. Not only does the history of neuroscience depend on a racialized cognitive imaginary, but so too does it depend on a sexualized one. This might seem evidence of craniometry's multiple model of mind rather than its idealism, but my point is not that they acknowledged multiple brains, so much as that craniometric thinkers in their modern day analogs assume an ideal brain, one against which others can and should be measured. Here that brain belongs to Cuvier, which is absurdly specific, but more broadly, it is the Northwestern European male of elite status whose brain has become the brain at this point in idealist neuroscience. Phrenology takes a different view, which is broadly perspectivist in that it assumes variation among brains that is both innate and environmentally determined. As you see on the left, phrenologists divided the brain into various areas or organs, which were larger or smaller in different individuals. There were originally 27 distinct organs or areas, which were gradually defined ever more specifically. In the image on the left, we see organs of perception, reflection, morality, self-perfecting, aspiring, domestic, and animal. And the phrenologist would use various means of measurement to determine the size of an individual's various organs. While people were assumed to be born with different brains, it was also assumed that their habits and circumstances would shape their brains such that individual variants became the intellectual foundation for phrenology, distinct from the search for distance from an ideal brain, fundamental to craniometry. Here we see the detail from an 1870 poster advertising a public lecture by a Dr. J.P. McLean, a member of the Aberdeen Phrenological Society of Scotland, evidently in the US, on a speaking tour. The small heads under the dictum to know thyself are models of different races, again depicted by the male heads of representative specimens and arranged chaotically throughout are eminent men, models of classical busts, a skull, a dog, and a wild pig. The eminent men are all white elite males, and I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that phrenology was an egalitarian intellectual project by any means. Certainly in a racist, sexist, colonialist culture, phrenology was used for racist, sexist, colonialist purposes. But my point is that the foundational assumptions of these two cognitive imaginaries are distinct. To a large degree in modern cognitive literary studies, they remain so. In this image, the different skulls are models of difference, not variation from a norm. And while those differences were organized in terms of social desirability and racist, sexist, colonialist stereotypes were certainly part of that project, the foundational assumptions of craniometry and phrenology differ widely. And we in cognitive literary studies live that difference in our scholarly lives. Here you see a very general visualization of my data so far, which arranges selected chapters from Lisa Sunshine's 2015 Oxford Handbook of Cognitive Literary Studies, including her editorial introduction, alongside selected articles from the 2019 Poetics Today special issue on cognitive literary studies edited by Nancy Easterlin. These texts are arranged on a spectrum from strong idealism to strong perspectivism. And in the next slide, I'll offer a very brief and general overview of the criteria I'm using, which are being sourced via discourse analysis of each text. Currently, I'm dividing responses into strongly and weakly idealist or perspectivist and intermediate. This is still obviously a very rough and ready system of analysis that I plan to refine. I also plan to add more texts to improve the study size. But here I hope you can see some of the outlines of the discourse analysis as it will emerge from these texts. I want to start with the intermediate position marked out here by Sunshine in her introductory chapter to the Oxford Handbook of Cognitive Literary Studies. In her chapter, Sunshine points out that cognitive literary studies is not a unified discipline. nor are there dominant methodologies or epistemological assumptions that undergird every work of cognitive literary studies. Indeed, Sunshine's point is precisely the opposite, and it is a valuable one to keep in mind. Quote, cognitive approaches to literature flourish at unexpected intersections, and like all new fields, ours is busily engaged in creating links between previously unlinked objects of inquiry. Any attempt to make blanket statements about cognitive literary studies should be treated with dubiety. Now for the strong idealists and strong perspectivists. In Barsha 2019, we see the assumption that there are good and bad behaviors and characters that result from cognitive deficiencies, deficiencies that proper pedagogy and the reading of the right texts can mitigate. While I am sympathetic to Barsha's desire to foster social justice concerns in students, I do wonder about the ethics of defining student perception and student character as good or bad. And certainly this is a highly Platonic view of both the reading process and the reader. In strong contrast, we see Keane, 2019, who writes from a post-colonial perspective that is strongly social constructivist, and thus sees universalizing rhetoric as inherently colonialist, therefore oppressive, and also not descriptive of reality, which is constructed via language rather than given. Where Barsha acknowledges multiple readers, but theorizes they're being shaped into similarity with an ideal reader, Keane assumes multiple readers with different knowledge bases and notes that creating empathy in a distant reader may even have unintended colonialist political effects. In other words, where the process of reading is predictable and valuable for Barsha. Compare this with Phillips, 2015, who takes a weakly idealist approach. Using quantitative methods, Phillips seeks to better understand the nature of attention and its different kinds. What is idealist here is not the acknowledgement of different readers and different reading processes, but the assumption that attention is a single thing in the brain that can be measured. To some degree, this may be warranted. I am not arguing that every single human brain is widely different from every other. And the fact that there are broad similarities is worth not merely acknowledging, but thinking with. At the same time, Easterlin, in her introduction to the Poetics Today special issue, pinpoints precisely this question. What is the degree of this broad similarity? And what is the cost of assuming cognitive similarity as a kind of Spivakian strategic essentialism that, while sometimes useful, places serious methodological burdens on scholars who assume cognitive similarity to a high degree? I don't have answers to this question, but I hope to. So what are we left with, at least at this stage of my project? What we are left with is hermeneutic questions I would invite us all to think with in our work as cognitive literary theorists. Are we assuming meaningful similarities between readers? Are we doing so despite cultural differences or historical distance? If so, how can we be sure this is warranted by evidence drawn from actual readers? If we do choose to acknowledge broad similarities in cognition, does this further warrant the assumption of perceptive similarity? Do all neurotypical people read in the same way? To what degree? And again, how do we know? If we assume that perceptive similarity in similar brains is a warranted assumption, on what grounds do we judge that similarity? Do people with similar experiences perceive literary texts similarly? What about male and female readers who have grown up in the same culture? Will they read a text in the same way? Or will the ways that gender operates differently in their lives shape their perception of a text? What about age differences or differences in sexuality or physical ability? In short, how does lived experience impact cognition and thus the cognitive processing of a narrative? In its broadest terms, what I am asking is how the effect of a text on a reader or on readers is theorized, because the methodological assumptions we make shape the results of our work in ways we need not simply to have thought about, but in ways we need to constantly reflect upon as part of our research process from its beginning to its conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very, very much. Next up is Adam Marcinkowski, who is a PhD candidate at York University. His research focuses on the relationship between theater, performance, and theories of emotions, And his dissertation, which is titled Scenes of Inquiry, a Poetics of Emotions, uses theater to examine how representations of emotions tend to flip into poetic strategies for enacting agency and moral character. And yours is the stage, Adam.
Hey, so just before I begin, I'd like to say thanks to Lorenzo for having us here, and thanks for everyone else for presenting. This has been really great so far. Let me just get my screen shared here. Here we go. Okay. Okay. So my presentation is today on sympathetic curiosity, sympathy's dark side. I'm looking at a playwright, Joanna Bailey. She's late 18th century or early 19th century. And specifically her introductory discourse for the first volume of plays she published, and her biggest tragedy, De Montfort. So to begin, there was a well-cited joke about Joanna Bailey written by Lord Byron. It goes like this. When Voltaire was asked why no woman has ever written even a tolerable tragedy, "Ah," said the patriarch, "the composition of a tragedy requires testicles. If this be true, Lord knows what Joanna Bailey does. I suppose she borrows them." So usually this joke is used as evidence for misogyny, as an explanatory principle for Bailey's failure to break into the London theater scene, and for her, until recently, relative historical obscurity. She published her first volume of plays, The Plays of the Passion, in 1798, anonymously. The three plays and the accompanying theory of drama presented in the volume's introduction were initially met with positive reviews. Her work appears to have made a splash amongst London's literati. Some even considered her the next Shakespeare. When the first play, De Montfort, was produced at Drury Lane in 1800, a reviewer leaked the author's identity as a woman, and the play closed shortly afterwards. From then on, Bailey struggled to get her work produced. Something I think we ought to consider, however, when thinking about this joke, was her domestic situation, which was intimately tied up with the lives of her uncles, the famous surgeons, anatomists, and collectors, William and John Hunter. After the death of both her father and William Bailey, and after her mother, her and her family moved into her deceased uncle's residence in London. Attached to that residence was a museum or cabinet of curiosities, as well as an anatomy theater where dissections were performed by her other uncle John and eventually her brother Matthew. She often spent time socializing at John Hunter's house, becoming close friends with her aunt, the poet Anne Hunter, who introduced her to London's elite. This house also contained an extraordinary cabinet of curiosity. John, his house, and his cabinet are reported to have been immortalized in Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. His work instigated the Hunterian Society, where experiments on the nervous system inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In these images of William and John, you can see them performing at the anatomy theater and posing next to bones and body parts and jars and so on. Sure enough, I checked William's collection, which is now at the Hunterian Museum at Glasgow, as well as John's collection at the Royal College of Surgeons Hunterian Museum, and both have examples of preserved testicles in jars. So it seems Joanna Bailey would have indeed had access to a pair while writing her plays. For the Baileys and the Hunters, these curiosities became a major source of income, and I would suggest that Byron's joke was meant to draw attention to how the commodification of curiosities in the Bailey and Hunter's household impacted Bailey's theory of sympathetic curiosity in her dramaturgical practice. Sympathetic curiosity names the desire to know the heart of another, and Bailey suggests that this desire is a near universal human propensity. Bailey compares the pleasure one gains from satisfying this curiosity to that same pleasure one gains and pays for when one comes to know the variety of things in a cabinet of curiosity. My presentation today looks at how Bailey uses curiosity to solve what has been long considered the paradox of tragedy, or why individuals gain pleasure when witnessing another's pain. Bailey's solution to this problem seems to preempt recent trends in cognitive science, which no longer consider theory of mind concepts such as sympathy or empathy as necessarily representative of our better angels. Empathy, as Fritz Greathoff argues, has a dark side. As previously noted, Bailey's theory of sympathetic curiosity participates in 18th century discourses of what psychologists today call theory of mind. Theory of mind simply refers to mind reading abilities or ability to interpret observed behavior in terms of underlying mental states. These 18th century discourses have in the past proved useful for those working in cognitive literary studies, many of whom link theory of mind to the novel. The novel is a useful genre for thinking about theory of mind, since as an art form, it relies almost entirely on imagination. Representations of characters in novels often require us to imagine their mental states. Similarly, the 18th century is an interesting period since as the novel form is being experimented with, The imagination is also being rigorously theorized. Joanna Bailey's work, for example, engages directly with Adam Smith, whose theory of the sympathetic imagination describes how social relations develop from the process of theory of mind in a way many Smith scholars today argue functions as a forerunner to the late 18th century novel. When it comes to theory of mind and literature specifically, there are currently two major hypotheses. The first is the requirement hypothesis, which just claims that engaging with fiction requires theory of mind. Empirical evidence supports this idea to some degree. Individuals who test poorly for theory of mind tend to also struggle with reading literature. The other hypothesis is the social improvement hypothesis, which suggests first that fiction can strengthen our capacity to understand the minds of others, and second, that these capacities are essential to forming a just community. While there is a long tradition of criticism of the social improvement hypothesis, specifically by those who claim it promotes bourgeois and colonialist values that reduce otherness to sameness, more recently, proponents of the hypothesis are beginning to turn against its egalitarian form because of problems that arise in the relationship between pleasure and theory of mind. Our desire to read another's mind may be just as egotistical and selfish as it is altruistic. One of the ways 18th century writers thought through this problem was with the paradox of tragedy. Two assumptions organize this paradox. The first is that when we read another person's mind, we share in that mind's experience. Adam Smith, for example, describes this capacity as, quote, a matter of fact, a bit of empirical evidence we can all assent to by consulting our own experiences. And he exemplifies this matter of fact by considering the phenomenon of contagious smiles, or how someone might wince in pain when they see someone else get hurt. This kind of sympathetic mind reading for Smith is automatic and reactive. If he had a concept of mirror neurons, he probably would have used them here. The second assumption is that pleasure and pain are motivational forces. We seek pleasure and avoid pain. So if a tragedy presents us with the pain of another, and we automatically reactively share in that pain, then the paradox asks, why don't we flee from tragedies? 18th century answers to this question include the neoclassical sublime, which someone like David Hume exemplifies when he considers how the pleasure of a skilled representation may outweigh the pain being represented. The romantic sublime, which we can link to Addison or Burke, and which claims that it's our distance from the pain that produces pleasure, either sort of matter-of-factly in the case of Burke, or through a process of self-reflection in the case of Addison. Adam Smith offers a third solution, a stoic sublime, where we take pleasure in the approval of someone's reaction to a painful situation. We see, for example, someone stub their toe, grit their teeth, and we are pleased by their demonstration of fortitude. Joanna Bailey's solution of the paradox is unique insofar as she simply elevates the pleasure of mind reading through the satisfaction of curiosity above whatever sympathetic pain may occur through the reading of minds. Her idea to shift focus to curiosity solves some problems in Burke and Smith. For Burke, our delight in the pain of others is simply a matter of fact. Without delight, we would never be sympathetic to another's pain because we would simply flee from that pain. Burke's answer here, however, is a bit circular, since we are asking why we find pleasure in the pain of others, and Burke more or less says that we do this because it's what we do. For Smith, curiosity explains why we move towards someone in pain. When we first see someone in distress, we are confronted by a feeling of, quote, curiosity to inquire into a situation. The first question which we ask is, what has befallen you? Once our curiosity is satisfied, we then enter into a sympathetic relation by judging the behavior relative to the individual circumstance, like an expression of fortitude. A shopper carrying on because a product is out of stock, to give another example, may be curious, but will also elicit little sympathy. But if that same shopper were to then explain that the product is a medical necessity for life, we may again feel sympathy. Though for Smith, curiosity is the prime motivational affect that enables one's entry into a system of sympathy, curiosity also creates the possibility for disrupting that system. Curiosity can cause us to, quote, pry into those secrets of our neighbors, which we have very justifiable reasons for concealing. But then, to disappoint this curiosity is equally disagreeable in its turn. To give a contemporary example, imagine you're in a bad mood at work. Your coworkers recognize you're upset and they each approach you to ask you what's wrong. But you're at work and what's bothering you is none of their business. So the questions are irritating and you tell them to move on. But then from their point of view, you have offended their attempts to sympathize with you and help you feel better. So they now feel insulted. Now everyone's upset. This problem of curiosity is minimized in Smith's work. It only appears in the final few pages of his book, and Smith dismisses it as something the man of propriety can simply avoid by using the capacity for theory of mind to imagine themselves from the other person's point of view and act accordingly. Smith's move to minimize curiosity as a motivational affect is typical of 18th century writers. Plato and Aristotle had named wonder and curiosity the first feelings of philosophy, and most later theorists follow suit. Burke, for example, starts his philosophical inquiry into the origins of the sublime and the beautiful describing curiosity as the first and simplest emotion of the human mind. But he, like Smith, quickly moves on from curiosity to explore more advanced emotions. For these philosophers, curiosity is the guiding passion of children, for whom everything is new, not adults who have a wealth of experience at their fingertips. Bailey refuses this move. In her view, everyone is perpetually curious about everyone, from the gossiping and tattling of children and servants to the conversational wit of those in high society. Curiosity is the glue that holds social relations together. It is possible to muster a resistance to this incessant curiosity about others. This resistance is not for Bailey a natural state of social life. To solve the problem of tragedy, Bailey considers how our perpetual curiosity about the ordinary folk we encounter daily might be amplified when put in proximity to people placed in extraordinary circumstances. The pleasure we receive from satisfying this amplified curiosity overrides any possible sympathetic pain we might experience. That is, if we even do experience any sympathetic pain at all. Oftentimes, Bailey says, sympathy towards others is simply a feigned response that we engage in to cover up our involuntary need to satisfy curiosity. She makes this claim matter-of-factly, which leaves the reader wondering how many times they have asked another what's wrong under the guise of sympathy, when really they were just curious. Her play De Montfort, which she claims is about hatred, is really about how sympathetic curiosity and hatred interact with one another. It begins first by demonstrating the role of curiosity as a theatrical principle. The play opens with servants gossiping about their master, De Montfort, who has been acting irritably. One asks, what has befallen the master? The other responds, I cannot tell thee, because he does not know. When De Montfort later enters the scene, the actions of the servants, who cast him sideways glances and move about on their tiptoes for fear of disturbing them, invites the audience to partake in also observing the master's curious moodiness. It is later revealed that De Montfort's rival Resendelt is in town, but the cause of De Montfort's behavior isn't just the resentment he feels towards his rival, it's his inability to express that resentment within a Smithian framework of sympathy. When his friends inquire into his situation, the question causes him distress. De Montfort finds the hatred painful, and he does not want to share that same feeling with others. The honorable thing would be to spare his friends that pain, but then his attempts to hide his hatred through a stoic and sublime reserve just lead to further disaster, since by not revealing his situation, he insults those who extend sympathetic friendship his way. This problem is further compounded by Resendelt himself, who alternates between sympathetic outreach and insults. He tries to stir De Montfort's anger, taking pleasure in watching his rival fail to control himself. Resendelt's capacity to empathize does not prevent him from being a bully, it motivates him. He enjoys the feeling of seeing his curious victim frustrated and angry, putting him in stressful situations. De Montfort is a proud, aristocratic man, and the lower class, yet upwardly mobile Resendelt takes pleasure in imagining the haughty De Montfort's painful mental states and ascribing himself as the cause. The play's plot proceeds through a series of catastrophic party scenes where the community fails to properly form because of this tension between De Montfort refusing the sympathy of others and Resendelt delighting in the torture of De Montfort. Eventually, De Montfort's sister Jane intervenes and engages in an early form of therapy, schooling him on how to act with propriety. The act is a success, and De Montfort and Resendelt reconcile at the next party. But then Bailey demonstrates how the capacity to engage in theory of mind can lead to calamity. A villain, Rimbault, is introduced, who approaches De Montfort and tells him that the reconciliation was the result of a conspiracy between Jane and Resendelt, who Grenfell claims intend to marry. De Montfort's sympathetic curiosity here mixes again with his hatred. He becomes susceptible to imagining false mental states in a manner we might today describe as paranoia. Guided by this paranoia, De Montfort follows Resendelt into the forest to seek revenge for this imagined slight. Bailey represents this paranoia through an allusion to Shakespeare's As You Like It. As the Duke in that play suggests, one can ascribe whatever mental or inner state to the forest one likes in order to make meaning out of trees and brooks and so on. Resendelt's description of the forest repeats some of the Duke's pastoral tone from Shakespeare's play. Resendelt reflects on the cry of an owl, which reminds him of his happy childhood playing in the forest, communing with animals. In contrast, driven by paranoia, De Montfort gives the forest a dark and secretive meaning. The forest speaks, but its meaning remains sinister and cloaked in shadow. But the evil lurking in the shadow of the forest is De Montfort himself. He ambushes Resendelt and slits his throat. After he murders his rival, De Montfort begins to hallucinate that the now dead body continues to mock him. It's then that he realizes the problem isn't external. It isn't Resendelt. It's inside him now. It's a problem with his nerves and with his brain. He does at that point the only thing he thinks he can. He cracks his skull open against a rock. Bailey's representation of sympathetic curiosity treats it as an involuntary and compulsive disposition. It's not so much that we can engage in mind-reading activities, it's that we cannot help but engage in them. And the act of mind-reading can then interact with other emotions, affects, or moods, altering perception and causing just as many problems as it does solutions. While Bailey has drawn some attention from cognitive studies scholars, most notably Alan Richardson, I think that interest in her work ought to be renewed given the more recent turn to theorizing the dark sides of empathy. One of the many lessons she attempts to communicate is a deep ambivalence about sympathy. Though the push and pull of sympathy and curiosity can lead to some social good, and Bailey explores that good in this play, especially through the character of Jane, she is also very clear in how the system can get caught up in and altered by other psychological states and social contexts, and that these alterations can just as easily dissolve and destroy the kinds of just community that proponents of the improvement hypothesis imagine sympathy and empathy create. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Adam. It was a lot packed into a very, very short time. And then we'll move on to our fourth panelist today, who's the Barsha, who's currently pursuing a PhD in English literature at the University of Delhi in India. The Barsha's research interests include, among others, cognitive narratology and poetics, phenomenology, Baul and Bhakti literature, and magic realism. Thank you, Barsha.
Yeah, hello everyone. I apologize for not creating a PowerPoint presentation due to some technical difficulties. So I'm just going to share my paper as I read along. So I guess that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, I hope you guys can see it. Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
My paper shall attempt to study the prophetic Bengal Baul, Lalon Fokir's translated song, Khachar Bhetor Ochin Pakhi, that is the unrecognized bird in the cage, through a cognitive literary lens, especially through an analysis of the variant metaphors called forth and conceptual blends constructed. The words of Lalon belong to the heritage tradition of the Baul culture in the late 18th century Bangladesh, Bengal, a form of sadhana, and sadhana means a form of learning, a form of devotional learning that contains unique cognitive scripts by their own right. Such scripts, however, are to be left dynamic and open-ended for schema accretion for the texts, as any other literary work, are hermeneutically variant with respect to the contexts read in. Baul is the Bengali version of the word Baura or Baula, used in northern part of India for someone who is possessed or crazy. In the Bhojpuri dialect, the verb form used for this term is Baurana. The Bauls were non-conformist and simplistic in nature, their songs reflecting not only the socio-political issues of its day, but also addressing the haunting of the self, reality, and the mutual transactions. The praxis of Baul poetry is rooted in Deho Tattva. Deho means body in Hindi and Sanskrit, and Tattva is ritual. It's a body ritual. That is what Deho Tattva means. And therefore invokes schemas of not only essentialist, esoteric, and meditative engagements with the environment, but also that of performative and enactive ones. Baul poetry is replete with spiritual and esoteric invocations, often advocating for a monist paradigm of the same. However, their poetry is not strictly metaphysical, but is grounded in the didactic dialectics of the very nature of experiential reality itself, both physical and beyond. As Manjita Mukherjee notes, the Baul body not only produces itself in space out of an active engagement with the many practices, both discursive and social, in its surrounding world, but also crucially produces that social material space in and through a dialogue with their own bodies and their lived experiences. The body is both materially manifest and spiritually intrinsic. The metaphor of the Dehabandho is often used to exemplify the corporeal vessel as a site for the coherent existence of both the individual, that is the Jivanatma, and the divine soul or the divine entity, that is the Paramatma. The Dehabandho metaphor is put forth via phrases such as Manush, Moner Manush, Ochin Pakhi, etc. On a closer look at such metaphors of the mind-body, one encounters the underlying conceptual metaphors, especially spatio-temporal ones, that attest to the lived experience of the Bauls as a spiritually enlightened and yet socially marginalized sect. Lalon's songs speak against the rampant social inequalities of the day, from the logical fallacies of casteism to that of the incumbent colonizers' policies. They often engage in a dialogic relation with the audience, one that finds its substrate in performative engagements with and within the environment. In the following Lalon Fokir song, or Lalon Giti, as the songs of Lalon Fokir are called, we shall inquire into the unique blended spaces achieved throughout the length of the poem. Blended spaces is a term taken from Gilles Fauconnier and Mark Turner's book, Mental Spaces. Blended spaces basically refers to a blending of two or more domains into a singular space. Any form of metaphor is a blended space, so to speak. We have resorted to translated versions of extant songs whose exact authorship is still debated. However, the following song, given its socio-spiritual currency and potency, can be considerably classified under Lalon's corpus in accordance to the historical studies conducted. Let us look at the following poem that was quoted by Tagore at his Oxford lectures and published in the book Religion of Man. How the unknown bird comes in the cage and how it goes out. If I could catch, tie the legs with the chain of my heart. 8 rooms and 9 doors are closed. Bright designs are there on these. There is the main room on the top. It is called the Mirror Palace. Oh, my mind, you are entrapped by the cage, but the cage is made of weak bamboos. You don't know when it will break, Lalon says, and the bird will eventually escape the cage and fly away. Lalon's song begins with a question, a contemplative and meditative state that puts up a semantic frame of a bird traversing in and out at will. Lalon Fokir's How Does the Unrecognized Bird Move In and Out of the Cage draws on a unique blended space that is at once dynamic and captive in nature. Engaging through such a blend requires a moment of contextual subversion wherein our prototypical schema of the caged bird is put to test with a sense of nonconformity. The bird in the following schema thereby achieves a certain sense of agency due to its apparent willful locomotion. The reader from the very first line constructs a frame that foregrounds the trajectory of the bird from one point inside the cage to that of one outside it laterally. This instantaneous and almost ephemeral frame of the bird's dynamic is further turned into a schema wherein the writer or the implied author puts forth the wish of attaching oneself to the self of the bird. It comes not as a surprise given the ontic of Baul poetry that perhaps the transient bird serves as a metaphor in itself for the other with the capital O. A stance that celebrates both vitalism and the agential properties of the so-stated higher being in its dialogic traffic with the self. The conceptual metaphors of human soul is a container object and the self is a site emerges on the following above occasions. As George Lakoff and Mark Johnson notes, events and actions are conceptualized metaphorically as objects, activities as substances, states as containers. The container object for Lakoff and Johnson thereby unites states, events, and actions into a synthetic whole, an ideal site for the dynamic nature of the soul mind as espoused in Lalon's texts. The soul mind of the Baul singer not only serves as registers for space and time, but also that of conceptual states, further supported and enhanced by the substrate of the acting agent in its environment. The question automatically arises of the contents of such a vessel-like or container form, and the answer, as is replete throughout the Baul corpus, is that of the traffic brought about by the simultaneous existence of the Atma, one soul, and the Paramatma, the supreme soul. The second line invokes a script of worship devotion, wherein one surrenders by falling towards the feet, perhaps an experiential spatial metaphor for the prostrate practice of prayers and rituals in certain cultures, such as the one addressed here. The following line also brings in the deictic view of the implied author and further enhances the devotion schema that was relatively absent in the first line, as we objectively imagine the absent present bird in the cage blend in the first place, as you can see above. It's just the question, how the unknown bird, the I comes in the second line. Till now, in the first line, it's just an objective stance. In the second line, the reader kind of, gets into the feet and looks at from an axis. Okay. So the second line brings in an human agent, wherein the sinews of the heart are metaphorically tied as chains around the bird's feet. Perhaps the materialist metaphor for the sinews is intangibly linked with its corporeal existence, a tension that is ensured by physicality's attempt at pinning down what appears to be ephemeral and metaphysical. This is another instance of a unique blend that makes a strong hermeneutical case within the contextual terrains of the Baul culture, given its genesis in colonial Bengal. The third and fourth line brings up the conceptual metaphor of body is a house that needn't have 8 rooms, but surely possesses 9 doors, including the one that is entered through, with bright designs in between. The house's attic, or the upper side, that is the skull or the head, or the on the physiognomy, it's the head side of the part, is the palace of is the place of mirror palace. Perhaps, as has been noted by Muchkund Dubey and Upendranath Bhattacharya, the sarcastic tone often found in Lalon Giti is manifest here in addressing the crown as a mirror palace, a locus for illusory patterns and hallucinatory visions. The next lines return us to the frame of the birdcage blend, wherein the implied author, in turn the reader, via the process of mentalizing. Mentalizing is the applicated version of Theory of Mind by Lisa Sunshine. It questions and how the implied author questions the mind on the integrity of the cage. A cage that is carved out of weak bamboo and thereby might fall apart at any moment as Lalon ponders upon its temporary nature. The falling apart of the cage signifies the liberation of not only the bird, but also the self that had attached the fetters of its heart to the bird's feet, and hence became one in the following act. In the final lines of the text, one starts to question the ontic of such a bird that arrives and departs irrespective of the cage's presence. The cage, literally embodying the concept of the container within itself, serves as the site of the devotee mind-body that is deprived of spiritual agency, whereas the bird further signifies an ephemeral divine entity that cannot be captured within the dynamics of such a bird cage frame. A critique on the very nature of framing itself arises, wherein its inability in capturing the ephemeral is addressed by the ability of the bird to traverse beyond apprehensive states. Perhaps the unknown bird serves as a metaphor for a mystic sense of divine agency. The reader, while mentalizing through the poem, in turn becomes an unconscious creator and experiencer of such newer, unique blended spaces that consciously urges us to reiterate and revisit the pasture of concepts such as agency, self, and reality itself. The paradoxical existence of Lalon's Moner Manush, one's own person, is not a symptom of mere socio-behavioral complexity, although it stems from exposures and realizations of the same. Lalon's unknown bird is rather manifest as Moner Manush in its elusive playfulness and thereby evokes an integral conceptual blend, one that is realized via esoteric practices such as bhakti, dharma, and sadhana. The songs of Lalan Fakir are abundant with imageries and metaphors of that unassailable being that is always already in a state of absent presentness, appearing to us as manifest, yet curtailing the possibility for a direct access of the same. It is in these variant descriptions and performative experiences of the nominal being with one's own self that Lalon's poetry directly challenges the conceptual metaphors and schema designs assimilated through the reader's experiential reality. Such a work then forces us to reflect and retrospect on the nature of our engagements with the world and in turn with our own psychosomatic selves. A likeness to a somewhat Ricardian hermeneutics pervades the ethos of many such songs in precisely knowing the self through its interaction with the others. The path of such knowing then is not a direct phenomenal paradigm, rather it is ephemeral, one that manifests within complex blended spaces constructed by esoteric, ritualistic, and meditative practices, a way that blends strict forms and bends static norms. Thank you. That's all to say.
Thank you so much, Barshi. That was also really, really interesting. And thank you once again to all 4 panelists, because this went way beyond anything I could expect in terms of how much material was assembled together under the semblance of a common conversation. I think that's especially exciting from my own point of view, at least. So I guess at this point, we still have a few minutes to open it up for Q&A. So I would encourage audience members to bring up their questions or comments as they may have them. So maybe one quick question that kept coming to my mind to get started, and it's for panelists. I was really fascinated by the variety of uses that you showed that cognitive theory can have for the purposes of exploring literary texts. I think Teresa's presentation, for example, did a very good job of showing how they can be used to historicize certain insights that poems contained in relation to fields, in this case, neurology and neuroscience, that were evolving at the same time, but as the poems that Wilde and Owen were writing, but that have not been put in conversation with them. I think Thomas's presentation was extremely interesting in the way in which he showed that the application of neuroscience brings out the problematic aspects of diversity that texts sometimes bring out but are not critically received. I was fascinated by Adam's demonstration, really, of how literature in reverse can be used to expose moral and value-based evaluations of theories that from cognitive science are applicable, but that the scientists themselves do not evaluate in these terms in their work. And then the Barsha's presentation was mind-blowing to me because it showed I think it really showed the explicative power of cognitive theories as a way to make sense of insights that even ancient literary texts might have contained for a long time, but that we just didn't have the critical grammar to access until now. So these are all uses of cognitive theories. I would be interested to hear what you have to say with respect to the necessity of a cognitive perspective. That is, these are ways in which we can approach this wide range of texts, but why is it not just useful but necessary to adopt this kind of perspective to make further sense of these texts? That is, to what extent can you say things when you have recourse to the vocabulary of cognitive theory that you wouldn't be able to articulate otherwise?
I personally think that the intersection of cognitive science with literature and vice versa is very helpful, not only for understanding just literature in its particular, but also human beings, human societies, human functionalities, societal practices, societal codes, prototypes in an entiretyness, because what cognitive science kind of in itself is a cumulative science. It takes on several things from other fields as well, and it's not a fundamental kind of subject like you can say for like chemistry or physics or maths. It's an integrative, it's a holistic one. So what happens is when we view a literary text from so many perspectives, so many different perspectives, it's always bound to give us some new reading, some new insight, and especially the cognitive part appeals to me strongly because basically it's us humans who read and write literature. At the end of the day, it's the Anthropocene making literature and doing literature. So this thing, it's a dialogic kind of thing, because we are making literature, but we are also trying to see how is it that we are making literature and why we are doing it. And I think cognitive studies gives us a very good insight into the not only just the neural basis, but also the socio-cognitive aspects of storytelling, of narrativity, and all this. And I think it has implications from medical humanities, from for trauma theory, for psychotherapy, and a lot of stuff. Because basic human minds go about by narrativizing reality and understanding reality through narratives, metaphors, and all that. So cognitive literary studies, I think it gets into the boots and explores that thing in a way.
Thank you, Barsha.
I agree with Debarshi, and I'd like to push that even further. I would say that anytime you're talking about a literary work, you have a theory of mind, you have there is a cognitivist assumption that you're making. And I love the phrase that you used, Lorenzo, the critical grammar. of cognitive literary studies allows us to be more reflexive about that and to be more explicit. One of the things that always concerns me as a literary critic is basically whenever I read an article that is proposing a reading of a text that is supposedly more correct than another, I always wonder, well, to whom and on what grounds, right? Because that is in some sense a cognitivist argument, and yet the grounds on which it seems to be made are often quite hidden. So to me, we are always doing cognitive literary studies. It's just a question of whether or not we're aware of it and whether or not we are being reflexive about that.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly to add, I mean, I think my view is similar to that of Barshi in that my aim is to put sort of marginalized human experiences to the front. And this possibly also chimes into the question by Ed in how we see disability studies. I mean, in the way that sort of to put sort of human experiences to the front that possibly weren't seen so far, and that require more sort of empathy and sort of more attention and more research. And to sort of shine a light on them, I think. Yeah, that's what comes to my mind now.
Thanks a lot.
If you don't mind, I would just like to respond to something, Lorenzo, you asked in the question. You mentioned that scientists don't typically include moral evaluative judgments in their research. But I think one of the things I'm interested in is how that doesn't quite happen the way we think it does, and that oftentimes moral evaluative judgments filter their way into research. For Bailey, anyway, her uncle William is the first person to talk about postpartum depression, because if a woman killed her child, she's a monster. And so he said, look, there's all these social economic factors and psychological factors, and these people are actually sick. And he's part of developing what's called a humanitarian narrative, where he would tell stories about sick or disabled people and appeal to their curiosity. And he built a career out of this, but then he would flip that curiosity into a sympathetic stance. And Bailey is running that in her plays. The play ends with Jane, I mentioned, as a positive view of sympathy. Jane does a sort of humanitarian narrative of her brother and asks the audience to sympathize with his mental illness. And then the other point I wanted to bring up was just part of this turning to the dark side of empathy. I did some research in the movement, and some of it's coming out of the failure of empathy to solve the problem of bullying. And so the research into empathy, a lot of it is guided by a sort of moral question, like how not to be a bully. And I specifically didn't really define or distinguish theory of mind from sympathy and empathy, because one of the conclusions that I found coming out of this is that bullies score sometimes high in empathy or sympathy or theory of mind, depending on how you define it. And so there seems to be this push to define like a good empathy and then a bad empathy, which is a sort of, in the study itself, there's already a kind of moral evaluation, and it's a kind of top down. It's like we start with what's good empathy because it solves bullying. Let's promote that. And then there's all kinds of research, does reading promote this kind of good empathy. And so I'm not entirely sure that you can disentangle the moral from the scientific like that.
Thank you so much for that. That's especially generative for me as an answer, because my own research has to do with neuroscientists being interested in the work of poets, which, does anything but try to divorce ethics and morality from an inquiry into human nature and its relationship to the world. So that's a very interesting perspective. And I think in general, all of your answers really brought to the foreground for me how not only useful, but actually essential, really, it is to further develop this encounter between what we do as literary critics and what's coming out of the laboratories of neuroscientific research. I see we have in the chat a multi-part question from Ed. I'll read it out just so we have it recorded in the as part of the session as well for later. So the first part is, how do you see disability studies relationship to cognitive science, and how do you or will you negotiate the overlaps in your project, again, between disability studies and your particular approach to cognitive literary studies? So maybe we can start with that and then move on to the second part of the question.
I mean, for me, this is central. If you are not acknowledging diversity of mentation, including people whose mentation might be called a disability, or I mean, I'm thinking about, there's some work on autistic cognitive approaches or understandings of literature that sort of make the argument that perhaps this is a return to a more oral form. I mean, I have some big questions about that, but at the same time, I think that, again, the relationship between disability studies and cognitive science is one that I think has been problematic. And one of the opportunities that we have as, as humanities scholars is to offer offer a reflection back to cognitive science that is much more concerned with methodological assumptions that I think cognitive scientists often have to make in order to do their work. And that's not necessarily a criticism of cognitive science so much as it is a comment on the ways that cognitive science needs weirdos from the humanities to remind them that some of the foundational assumptions that they are forced to make in order to do their work may form a burden, not just for them, but honestly for real human beings out in the world.
Thank you, Thomas.
Go ahead, Teresa.
If I may. I think I've already addressed the disability part of your question in my previous answer, but to find your the next part about how does one mediate the over medicalization of human difference in cognitive literary studies. I find that very interesting because sort of I think the underpinning of my whole work is the phenomena that we have in the poems and the literary works that I study are not sort of that of sick people, of people who have medical issues, but rather how through their life and through sort of the social context, these issues that they're experiencing in their real lives and in the poems that they then produce sort of are harmoniously, or how should I say, organically sort of created. I mean, I'm not a friend of calling people sick, because I mean, there's something in sort of psychotherapy, there's something called the trauma model, that people aren't really sick, but they have been traumatized, for example. And like there are studies that basically up to 90% of depressed people had sort of traumatic experiences that they may not overtly remember, or that maybe happened when they were very small children, for example. So I find this sort of the concept of medicalization, I find that very difficult to sort of negotiate, because sort of I think that the overwhelming sort of stance in the world or mainstream at the moment is to call people who are depressed sick, or that they have to change their thoughts, when actually what is not really looked at is whether their depression is not a sort of reasonable within their life, sort of not a reasonable response to difficulties that they had that are not their fault, for example. So I find it very interesting sort of that so much today is medicalized, which may, with sort of empathy and sort of looking at people's life histories, maybe explained differently, when with more compassion perhaps, rather than just saying you have to change the way you think or you have to change your behavior, rather than through the sort of the organic bodily and sort of somatic experiences and processes that a person goes through. Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa.
I was to answer Ed's question about disability studies, for me, it becomes a really complicated topic because in my work, what I'm using Bailey for is to think about the commodification of interiority and the commodification of difference and the commodification of emotion. And so one of the things she wants to do is put difference on display and then try and build a sort of empathetic relationship. But she's doing this within the context of her commercial society. And commercial society is what she thinks is natural. So she writes plays. She wrote a play for the governor of Sri Lanka to sort of help teach the Sri Lankans how to enter into commercial society better through this process of sympathetic curiosity. And for her, at least, she thinks it's really difference is always going to sort of capture our attention in possibly really dark and offensive ways. So a disabled person makes an appearance in her text when she's talking about how we may actually not have sympathy for people. We feign our sympathy to find out about their feelings and their how they're feeling. So there's a disabled person who she said that's the example where we feign our sympathy and cast a glance by asking, how are you? How are you feeling? And so it's a complex topic. And what I'm trying to use her for is to move into thinking about how the commodification of interiority has started structuring daily life in corporate or even retail situations, which is where my sort of examples came from. And I think that people who are neurodiverse or people who suffer from disabilities are in some ways always kind of excluded from that social structure. And that's one of the things Bailey is getting at, is like these for her, by being extraordinary, like they catch our attention in really sort of dark and easily commodifiable ways.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Thomas, Adam, and Teresa. I mean, it's a problematic thing to associate or to medicalize, disability within the cognitive literary sector. For example, there's this specific problem of aphantasia, like people can't imagine mental images, and that's a big problem for people who think of literature as something in which you process mental images. So how do you deal with something like that? It turns out that it's not that people with aphantasia cannot understand the text. It's just that their understanding of text varies from our intuitionistic understanding of a text. We think that we think through mental images and stuff, but turns out it's not that way. It's through other forms, other methods. And I think it will be very helpful for, as the cognitive science as an entire discipline, to be open-ended towards to the humanities, towards the social sciences, because or else it will run a risk of overgeneralizing the human, like the prototype human, the prototype reader. I think that becomes a problem because the reader is not a prototype being. It's not something you can program something into. It's a whole evolutionary and cultural thing. It's not just genetics or mimetics. It's both combined into what makes a reader. So of course, neurodiversity and everything has to be kept into concern. And also, not only the cultural codes, but also, as Teresa said, how a human has grown up, their conditioning, their context and everything kind of matters a lot. And I think humanities has a lot to say regarding differences of humans and differences in perceiving those realities, and how you can make a deal with the cognitive sciences and how to avoid overt generalizations that might run bigger risks if not caught at the first place itself.
Thank you, Debashi. Thank you all. Ed, I think we have already started to cross over into the second part of your question. So was there anything that you wanted to add besides what you have typed in the chat?
Not particularly. I really appreciate all of the thorough answers to my question. I definitely agree with a lot of what's been said. It is a complicated project, but I think there's a difference too. I don't know. I definitely I'm concerned in my work with the real danger, the evident danger of simply importing the terminology from cognitive science to literary studies in a way that assumes sort of the transparency of that methodology. And I do think that crossing disability studies over into cog-sci can be really productive in that way, insofar as Thomas was describing, right, in terms of the weirdos from the humanities generously reminding them of their assumptions, right, which I'm sure is always welcome. But so yeah, I think what disability studies can do for cog-sci is kind of flip that assumption about medicalization on its head and really bring in like forms of empowerment, right? So rather than disabled folks being constructed as suffering from their disabilities, or by it being sort of somehow inappropriate for them to be centered, actually centering the disabled body and centering neurodiversity in cognitive science, I think makes a lot of sense and can I think bring a lot of productivity to. I could see it sort of making projects like these even more productive than they are, and I'm just excited by that. So thank you for the responses.
Yeah, and I want to add that for me, particularly Teresa's project on dissociation, I pricked up my ears there, because Teresa was working with a fairly medicalized definition of dissociation. And it reminded me of Donnell B. Stern's 2013 formulation of dissociation. It's in the book Unformulated Experience. And what he says is that, okay, so there's this sort of very scientific cognitive way of thinking about dissociation, which is, there's nothing wrong with it. But there's also a social constructivist way of thinking about dissociation as unformulated experience. And as, right, because like, okay, so we all have brains, fair enough, but we all perceive with them, right? These are tools. So just like, I mean, okay, so there's a fairly like similar shape that every hammer has, but it's used for different purposes, right? And so I think one of the things that we can do in cognitive literary studies is to remind cognitive scientists and each other that just because we have similar tools doesn't mean that we're using them in the same way, right? So somebody who is choosing not to formulate a particular experience is engaging in a sort of purposive dissociation, right? And this is something that we see, like, if you ever heard somebody say, I don't see race, or I don't think there is such a thing as sexism, they are engaging in purposive unformulated experience, even though they have that experience available to them, right? So to me, this is a way of speaking back to the sort of overly mechanistic model of mind that I think sometimes invades our thinking about mentation.
Oh my God, that's so interesting. Thank you. So it's by Stearns and Unformulated Experience. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'll tell you what, I'll put the name in the chat so that you can just copy and paste it.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that note of caution, Ed, because it's one that actually has, I think, in my research I found, has tried to creep its way into the realm of hard neuroscience for a while. I'm reminded of a phrase that Oliver Sacks used in his book Awakening, so we go all the way back to 1973, where he encouraged his readers to think of the patients that he was describing there not as sick people, but as subjectivities that inhabited different landscapes of being. And thereafter, his intent has been to try to push for this redescription, not of an abnormal subjectivity, but one that just differs and whose difference has to be understood in order to make clearer sense of our own as well. So I think that's really a wonderful note to close on. In fact, we're just 15 minutes over, so we did do pretty well, I think, by conference standards. and I don't want to hold anybody on beyond what they had signed up for. Unless there are any last questions or comments that anybody wants to make.
Yeah, sorry, who was the researcher and the book that you mentioned that was the last one that you mentioned?
Oliver Sacks.
Oh, okay, yeah.
His neurology, yes. His book Awakenings is the one that the movie with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro was based on. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you again for organizing this whole panel. It was fascinating, and thank you also to all the speakers. It's wonderful that we're able to meet even though we're not physically in Las Vegas.
Right, right. Which I think in the case of a place like Las Vegas is perhaps the best way to gather in it actually in the 21st century. So there's the added adequateness of the means. Thank you so much, everybody. This was truly, truly fascinating. And best of luck to all with the rest of your work. I look forward to seeing where it goes next.
Yeah, thank you very much, all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for having us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.